All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the February 2020 Coffee and CEO event from the Dissemination of Behavior Analysis. I am very happy to say that we have a fantastic panel of incredible behavior analysts who are going to share their experiences within the dissemination of behavior analysis on a global perspective. I do have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share, so please excuse the quick latency. All right. All right, so shameless plug before we even start the panel, I do want to talk about some of the boons and benefits of joining the DBA SIG. What are the boons and benefits include? Free monthly CEs through Coffee and CEUs. We host these sort of events once a month on different and varying weekends throughout the month. And we bring in fantastic folks like the panelists that we have here today. And for those who can't make it to these sorts of events, that's A-okay, because they are recorded, and we do share the recording link with our the folks who do sign up for the presentation. Also, we host a annual dissemination grant that's open to all DBA members. If you have a project that you want some additional funding and mentorship for, please, by all means, apply to the grant. If I'm not mistaken, the first grant was actually started by Megan Miller, who is a panelist in today's conversation, funny enough. And so we've had incredible folks who have applied and have won the grant. And if you don't win one year, please know that you are always more than welcome to apply the following year as well. Quarterly town hall meetings, we host these once a quarter. We started last quarter, and for this first quarter of the year, we're going to have one next month. We're still working out details on the dates, but check your newsletters and your email to find out what dates we decided upon. And it's also, the DBA is a not-for-profit, so you'll be contributing to a not-for-profit. So if you are interested in becoming a member, you can always reach out to us at disseminate.aba@gmail.com. And if you do want to become a member off the bat, then I would recommend going to broadcastbehavior.com, and the information's there. And just some etiquettes so that we're all on the same page. If you're participating via a phone, and I don't think anyone is, but if you are, then please mute your mic when you do come in, and send me a quick email at disseminate.aba@gmail.com. Let me know what your phone number is and also what your name is, so I can reference and see who you are with the attendance spreadsheet that we have. In order for you to obtain a CE, I need to have I collect attendance information, but I also sent out a Google survey. So once you fill out the Google survey, give me about 2 weeks max for me to send out a certificate for your CE certification. And we also have ASRs that I have embedded within this talk. So please, by all means, if you want to contribute vocally, you're more than welcome to do so. If you want to contribute via the chat, you are more than welcome to do so as well. And yeah, so I guess now that we have covered the etiquette or the rules and guidelines and what have you, I do want to quickly mention that we do have another talk coming up actually next week for our March 2020 event, and it's going to be with the wonderful Denisha Gingles from Beautiful Humans podcast, and she's going to be discussing Justice Act and ABA, a personal commitment to a better world. If you haven't obtained your seat for the presentation, check your emails. We sent out a newsletter not so long ago. And now let's meet our panelists. So maybe we can quickly introduce ourselves and mention our name, our backgrounds, and also mention where are you working out of currently?
Okay. Hi, I'm Akanksha Chetri. I'm originally from India, and I started my career there. And I am a BCBA, and I'm practicing in Ghana and Nigeria, and I work with Autism Compassion Africa.
I am Amelia Andrews. I am a BCBA living in the Czech Republic in České Budějovice. I work at a place called Centrum Bazdelka, where we have multi-handicapped children and adults, and I am the only BCBA in a large radius in this area.
Hi, I'm Megan Miller. I live in St. Petersburg, Florida, and I work in a few different capacities. My main job right now is working as the Vice President of Clinical Services for Life Tribe based here in St. Petersburg. I'm a BCBAD, and I do a lot of dissemination, both through traveling internationally to different countries, providing coaching and training, and also just online, putting out a lot of online content to help train people in best practices for behavior analysis, mostly focused with autism.
Hello, I'm Mike Mueller. I'm a behavior analyst. Got certified in 2002. I have a couple different companies that are both involved with providing services largely around kids with autism and developmental disabilities, consultation company in Atlanta, Georgia, and a publication company where we do books and teaching materials. We publish the AFLs. And most recently, and probably most pertinent to this particular panel, the executive director for the International Behavior Analysis Board, which is going to certify behavior therapists and behavior analysts abroad, both for various levels of community protection, their own acknowledgement, ethics, cultural guidelines, and actually two of my fellow panelists here today are on the professional advisory board. So a little about me.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Shane. I'm a BCBA here in Ormond Beach, Florida, which is just north of Daytona. And I work in a couple different capacities as well. My primary job is I'm the Director of Training and Dissemination at Positive Behavior Supports. And I teach at Arizona State and FIT currently. So that's a lot of what I do.
Wonderful. All righty. So let's start with some questions. So, so during the BACB's third episode of their Inside the BACB podcast, the leadership there discussed how many countries outside the United States and Canada have described how the BACB certification is inappropriate for their country. They discussed how the task list and the PEC may not necessarily be in line with their cultural norms of other countries, while other countries have brought up how certification from outside their own country may not be culturally accepted. And yes, you know, the United States and Canada is a melting pot of cultures and languages and contexts. So panel, please describe in your own words how these changes may actually change our field as a whole, and also discuss if this affects your current practice in any way, shape, or form.
I can answer part of that. I think it's a unique opportunity. I think the you know, part of the process that we're going through right now with our professional advisory board is we have broken up into smaller committees to rethink and reconceptualize the way that behavior analysts are trained and become certified. So although it really didn't kind of start out that way, what it really has turned into is we have, I think, about 45 people from about 30 different countries broken up into these committees and dedicated to the task of not trying to follow what the BACB has done, but look at these new requirements with fresh eyes. And the cool thing about that is because you have people from all over the world that are bringing their perspectives to bear on this particular issue, that it's culturally relevant because people from the Middle Eastern countries have different considerations than they do in South America, than they do in Eastern Europe and in Russia and all over the place. So it's becoming an interesting project because some of the ways in which people practice or should become trained are probably pretty static. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that are probably dynamic based on both what you do professionally and where you practice those things. So kind of to get back to the original question, with the BACB's announcement to discontinue those certifications abroad, some people are kind of looking at it like it has kind of left some people behind, but the more and more people that we talk to, the more and more evident it has become that it was never really geared to that. There were a lot of barriers and obstacles for people living abroad to meet the requirements and the increased regulations that went along with the board. So from my personal experience, it's going to allow us to develop something in its place, not replace it, but develop something in its place that does take those issues into consideration really from the very beginning.
So discussions about our ethical compliance code and modifying them have always been a topic of ongoing debate and discussion. And, there's always room for improvement. Having practiced only outside of the North American context, I see where the deficits were in that, with it being inclusive. However, that also raises the question of how to tackle the issue. When the announcement was made, it was a shock to stakeholders outside of the North American context. And as the question states, is the North American context only about this one idea of a culture within USA and Canada? Is it not reductive in a certain sense? As for the areas I have practiced in, people already struggle quite a bit, whether we are talking about communities that do not have access to good interventions and best practices, or whether it's the students of ABA that are trying to study toward their certifications. Supervisors are few and far in between. Cost of supervision and coursework is way above the pay scales of most of our countries. The examination is not always accessible to those that want a career in the field. So with these new changes, people were definitely panicking. And I also saw that this would really affect the most vulnerable populations, because you're opening them up to exploitation and fat treatments because there's no governing board. So anyone could say anything about, being a behavior analyst, and this would, I think, in turn greatly affect our ability to disseminate and effectively represent our field.
So the way I look at it is that when I read the rationale and I heard what the board had to say about why they decided to do this, I kind of understood where they're coming from. I'm American, but I've been practicing here in the Czech Republic for 3 years now, and ABA is still in its infancy here. So for us here in this country, we look at the certification as like the standard. It's the only thing we have to really kind of indicate some minor, like the minimum level of competence here. Otherwise, it's just rampant, whoever calls themselves what. The problem with the board removing certification internationally is that now it's created this hole that exists, and it's left the individual countries to fill that hole, which I understand. But it's kind of makes more sense in countries that are better established with or have way more people than ones here where I'm one of 3. And at least as an outsider, it's not really my place to come in and kind of interject some American like ideal. This is not, it's not my country, it's not my place to do that. So there's really 2 people here who are really trying to build now what is like the equivalent of certification here, and that can be a little bit more complicated because they might try to model the standards that exist with the board, but there's also nothing to really check that against. So I guess before I lose myself completely in my thought here, I understood why the board did what it did. It doesn't affect me too much because the truth is that most of my clients and their parents don't really, like, they're excited that you have a BCBA, but they're not really sure what that means. I worry that it creates this hole, and how that hole will be filled is what I'm more worried about.
I guess I'll go next. Thanks. Everyone's kind of touched on similar content, so I'll sort of address a different piece of it. And I think we may have a question that talks about this a little bit later, but unfortunately for me, one of the big things that came out from their explanation of this decision, we've already had discussions about behavior analysis and our certification, not necessarily recognizing the need to have training in understanding other cultures. And to to say we're not certifying outside of North America, but also it doesn't really help me understand how we're tackling the big picture of we're all working with different cultures anyway. So even just looking at the work I do in the United States, I'm going to be working with other cultures. Just living here doesn't mean I won't be. And the culture could be from family to family or from different backgrounds living anywhere else throughout the world. So for me, it kind of makes me wonder how concerned the BACB is about developing competencies with any of us working with others and how to collaborate and understand different cultures. So there's that piece of it too that's concerning for me. I know we're going to touch on that a bit later, but in addition to everything that everyone said on the panel so far, that's one of the big things that jumped out to me is like, so we just don't care about that at all.
Yeah, and to kind of go into that further too, like teaching on the university level, what I'm seeing now is that now it's going to be one of those things at the university level where you have students that are international students. I've taught students in India, Germany, Japan, China, all over Africa, and you have this group of people that are really invested and want to do good science, and they want to go out there and perform. And there is still value in the training, but there's now less of a value in going and getting trained as a behavior analyst because it doesn't lead anywhere right now. So now it's like, okay, I can go do this training, I can get this degree, I can become this really cool scientist, but now it's going to be like, that's it, because it means nothing where I'm at now. And that goes back to like the conversation of those gaps. And I'm seeing that more on the university level than I am seeing that on like the private practice level. Because on the private practice level, I'm still working in the field, I'm still feet on the ground in the United States, but on the university level where you have 500, 600, 700 students in a section, now half of them are going to be gone because half of them are international students. So I have a feeling that that's something that's going to be a unique change, is whatever fills that gap, whatever kind of steps in for that power vacuum, essentially, whatever's going to come in is going to have to establish some kind of meaningful way to train people as well. Because right now, the only quote unquote meaningful training, I know it's not that it's the meaningful training, but right now the only thing that's there is that coursework, that sequence, that VCS. It's not going to mean the same thing for another certifying board unless it's established or built into that infrastructure. So I'm interested to see how that goes.
We actually have two great comments from the chat box, if you don't mind me quickly vocalizing this, from Valeria. Valeria says, completely agree with Amelia. I work in Brazil. I think we're in better shape with 2 established organizations and a local certification in the work. That's awesome. That many other countries. And out there, forgive me for not saying that correctly, Senegal here, there is only me. And I only got a BCBA certified last October. Congrats. Absolutely zero ABA infrastructure present here. And as far as I know, in French-speaking West Africa in general. So there's those really awesome. And if you want to contribute to the chat, again, vocally or through text, please do.
Hey, one interesting thing I think is just kind of a historical perspective a little bit. And someone mentioned that, ABA in a lot of countries around the world is really in its infancy. So are the attitudes towards people with developmental disabilities and autism and different treatment modalities, what's accepted, what's not, where information comes from, lack of public information and those kind of campaigns that have shaped the U.S. narrative and U.S. culture. We see commercials from Autism Speaks and things like that, right? There's pretty well-funded campaigns that have shaped American public attitudes towards this, federal special education laws and things like that. There are a lot of things that are very, very different in different countries. I think from the perspective that if you look at what the field, the profession of behavior analysis, the BACB has really established kind of a requirement, or at least the notion that if you're going into this profession, then you get a certification. It wasn't like that, for a long time. And it's increasingly like that because obviously of funding, regulations, insurance, state licensure, and things like that. But even before it had those connections and that meaning, So go from like 2001 to 2007, 8, 9, when it was still basically just a voluntary thing. It wasn't really required in most places. To go from even that stage to where we are in 2020, there's the expectation that if you're going into this field, you're getting certified. And that's always been the BCBA, because that's essentially the only thing that there's been. So this expectation has been developed. So I don't, and as the field kind of grows in these other places from infancy to, getting its legs under it, I don't think that that's going to change. I think there's still going to be an expectation that really to make it in the field, to go to a certain level, it will come with some kind of certification process. But like Shane said, what that looks like is still being developed. So it's probably a very worrisome time for some people without those answers, but trying to be part of the solution to answer some of those questions, it's a really exciting time right now also.
There we go. Sorry, I was on mute. Wonderful. Okay, so this could lead us into our next question. So what can the board do to help facilitate effective, quality, and meaningful behavior analytic practices when certificates are providing services to individuals from other countries? What are some of the different tactics that the BACB can do? And I also wanted to quickly, maybe this might be the right time to do so, quickly mention the board's mission and vision. When I was listening to the Inside the BACB third episode, podcast episode, there was a mention of how the board's mission and vision would have to change, which I thought was fascinating. Like, yeah, that's valid, yeah. So I'm going to quickly read this. With this in mind, I do question what are the sort of tactics that can be done, and how can we assist with that sort of process. So the global mission: to protect consumers of behavior analysis services worldwide by systematically establishing, promoting, and disseminating professional standards. And the global vision: to help solve a wide variety of socially significant problems by increasing the availability of qualified behavior analysts around the world. So with that in mind, take it away, panelists.
I have a very strong opinion about this. So if everybody's cool, I'm going to jump on this one first. So I think that at the very core of it, if we look at what happened with the board and their changeover, I think it's important to recognize that the board is saying that they can't, right? Ultimately, what they're saying is they don't have the infrastructure to do what needs to be done to support the level of global initiatives that they were initially looking at. And so starting with that and understanding that the board is saying, like, we can't do this anymore, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the infrastructure, whatever, I think that's an important kind of frame as we start going through this. Now, I think given that they've made this decision and this is where they're at, I think what will be most helpful for the board, and some things that they can do, is that they can do some consultation, they can do some guidance, they can provide some tools, they can do those things that would help support growth in those areas. I would like to see a lot of what they are planning to do, because they have talked about offering those services and lending that out, but they haven't really spelled out what that looks like. And so I think that that is going to be something that they could probably provide a little bit more transparency on, simply because I think that people like Matt was just saying, or Mike was just saying, that things are a little bit hectic right now. Things are a little bit tenuous right now, and people don't really know what's happening. So a little bit of clarity on that and what they can do and what they can offer and what they can provide would go a long way, I think, especially for those people who are trying to jump in and fill those gaps and make it so that there are these other places that are establishing these boards.
Yeah, I agree. I think from the discussions that we've had, there's the way that any future credential will exist will probably vary nationally or regionally. We had a meeting this morning in which there was 2 individuals from Vietnam, and they are 2 weeks away from basically having the government approval for an internal process. Brazil, as was mentioned previously, they have a local certification and a national, professional body. And that's what one of the things that was mentioned in the podcast was that infrastructure like behavior analysis infrastructure in these different places means different things, and their people are sort of, you know, at varying steps on the ladder. And so what Jim Carr was referring to, in part at least, was, is there a professional association? Is there organization somehow? So when Amelia is talking about, you know, there's 3 people, right? She may be in an area where the infrastructure is not well developed relative to Vietnam, where they are literally just 2 weeks away from the education ministry, you know, approving what they've worked on over the past couple of years. So whether it's our certification or something else, how we move forward after, you know, certain short-term goals are met will probably vary by some of those same components. How we could integrate into a system that's well developed may be different than how we integrate into a system where we may be the ones to help shape the beginning of that infrastructure. But I think you're right. I think the problem, one of the defining reasons why they decided to make the changes that they made, were that you can't do what you've done in the US everywhere at the same time. It's too big, it's too broad. The BACB has come a long way since 1998. It sort of maybe blurred the lines between what a certification program is and what licensure is, and it's sort of in a, I think at points in time, kind of in a gray area in between. But it didn't get there overnight. You know, it had a lot of influences and pressures leading to what it has become right now. But to try to expect that same level of regulation and oversight in 80 other countries, right out of the gate, is an impossible task. So it'll have to be shaped by, you know, where these different countries or regions are related to, you know, their own internal process.
There we go. If I can jump in on this now. As far as like what the board can do, I know here when establishing like the process for certification here in the Czech Republic, there's talks with the government about having the BCBA certificate like counting for something here, but the government basically says like we can't have another nation certificate be required for our people, which I fully understand. But that was heavily involved in a lot of the talks. I think what the board moving forward needs to do is have some sort of, like, they say that they obviously don't have the capacity to handle international, which I totally understand. There's a lot of different cultures, different regulations, a lot of different things, but they need to have some sort of like stamp of approval, I think, because like it or not, the BACB and ABA go hand in hand. Like, you can't think of one without the other, really. I look at my edition of Cooper, and the first thing that you see is the task list for, you know, the board. These things are interlinked, and I think for a very long time they're still going to continue to be. I think people, no matter what, are still going to look towards the board as meaning something even outside of the United States. And so what I would like to see, and I'm hoping what they can do to help others over here working overseas, is really kind of say like, you can't, like, this certification was meant for here, but we can kind of give you like we agree with your coursework, or it meets the standards that we would have had, but we can't ourselves issue that certificate. I think doing that would probably help, at least looking at things in this country. I can see where that would help us.
I think it's an interesting idea. I know the way that we're going about doing that is kind of almost the opposite, though. I've tried to put out to everybody to the extent that you can, right? I mean, it's a history that we can't ignore and shouldn't, that we can learn things from, you know, the good parts and the bad parts of what people have done before us. But to the extent that we can set all of that aside and try to rethink the entire process, that's the route that I'm encouraging our our advisory board to go to, so that we don't try to replicate, for a number of different reasons, what has been done before. But I think you're right. I think the current mindset right now is that these two things are inextricably linked because of the recent history of the regulation, and really the expectation that if you're going to practice in this field, that's the only gateway that exists for practicing. That's basically what they've defined, all those things essentially by default over time because of the regulation and oversight that they've required. But if you can try to kind of like shake off, those connections and look at it and start asking yourself, what does it mean to train somebody? What is the product that we want to have? How do you make those determinations? How did they make the determinations? What does it mean to have 1,000 hours of practice supervised at 5% versus 1,500 supervised at 30%? What's the impact of different kind of supervisors? Some of like in terms of outcome, which I don't know, some people are doing some cohort studies where they're able to pull some of that out. But how do you control quality over quantity? How do you address the barriers where people don't have access to master's programs at all, and so they only have a VCS or what could become a VCS equivalent core sequence? Is a master's degree, no, obviously if it's in a related field, there's benefit necessarily, but is a master's degree required for behavior analysis certification? Is it a practitioner certification? Are there inherent differences? What are the requirements? Should there be post-supervision requirements? Post-supervision post-certification supervision. How are CEs made relevant, right? So that I'm not required to sit through 9 hours of insurance billing fraud when my company doesn't bill insurance, right? I mean, how do you make these things relevant and helpful to what people do? And that's why I sort of meant it's an exciting time, because now that we've had a few weeks to sort of get into this mindset of how do we start something brand new and make it relevant to people, ask people from all over the place what's most relevant, what they would want to see, what is needed in their area, because it's going to be impossible, from what I've found, to have a one-size-fits-all program certificate that meets varying levels of ethical considerations and cultural considerations. It may have to be dynamic from the start, and it's again, there's a lot of unknown, but it's a cool process to be part of and to see people make these kind of recommendations. We had a meeting this morning where someone suggested, well, maybe it's really not an hours requirement that leads up to the certification. Maybe it's a series of competency tests. Maybe it's more task related. And maybe that if you can do that and you've got whatever experiences you have and you can do that in 6 months, then why not 6 months? If it takes someone else a year and a half to meet those same requirements, maybe that's just on them. And maybe you have different levels to the training, or levels to post-certification supervision and mentorship after someone's certified counts as continuing ed, because at least it's relevant to both the supervisor and supervisee. So we're looking at it totally differently, and I understand where it comes from. Like, we need, there's this expectation that it is and kind of looks and behaves a certain way, but if you try to kind of step out of that mold that we've all been put in, it really opens up some possibilities to some interesting, more progressive ideas.
And if I may interject, I want to highlight some of the things that the folks in the chat have been saying. So Valeria mentioned the certification process, in context to the certification process over there. In the works in Brazil, it's currently in the process of its creation, but it's not ready yet. But it is a voluntary certification. It is not yet to the point where laws have been voted that require people to be certified to provide services. It is still a free-for-all. Whitney chimes in with, there are only a handful of BCBAs in West Africa, which is the size of the United States. I don't see a national certification here in Ghana anytime soon. The government just started certifying teachers 1 year ago. Valeria also mentions in the certification project in Brazil, they plan to grandfather in current BCBAs. Tanera mentions, I agree that post-certification supervision is something that should be explored further. And then Shane mentions, which I chuckled, I would have loved some post-certification supervision. Trial by fire is exhausting. Boy, is it ever. Radhika mentions, I totally agree. I really like the post-certification supervision idea. So somewhat like a PSI, mentioned by Kayla. Radhika is asking what PSI is. And then Tanera mentions, I lived in the United States, but it is hard for me to find people accessible locally to just even network with, which is interesting. Stephanie mentions, I am in Spain, practicing in a clinic that provides ABA along with speech and OT. However, no one here understands what my BCBA certification means and what being certified means to them. I also do not see national certification occurring anytime soon. Rachel mentions, I agree, the post-certification is necessary for most. And Adar mentions, loving the post-certification mentorship supervision ideas. There are no master's degree programs here in Senegal. So it seems as if a lot of folks are global in our conversation today, which is wonderful, but also have seen the difficulties with this decision and how it applies to their own context within their own countries.
Yeah, we've had some really good discussions, and up until that point, I know myself personally, I'm just kind of going down the road that's been paved for us by the BACB, and I really haven't questioned it. I've been irritated at times by certain things, just my own personality, but until there's this opportunity to do something about it. So now that we've had this majority opinion that says when a lot of BCBAs come out in the field, they're not ready. They're not ready to practice. Many are, right? But just getting that certificate doesn't necessarily mean for a lot of people that they're ready, competent, confident. And it's a strange thing though, because at least here around our private practice is mostly in public schools. So if you have a BCBA and you walk into a public school in Georgia, you're looked at as an autism expert, a behavior expert. You can set up classrooms, you can run trials, the literature inside and out. And there is it has this halo around what it is. And people really do sort of misunderstand what it is and what it's not. And it's probably hard to get away from that. But I do the hiring at our company also. And there's a lot of people where they have BCBA, they have, academic record, their vita looks the same as everybody else's, but they're not ready. They're not ready to hit the ground running. They're not even ready with supervision. We do weekly supervision with all of our BCBAs, and it's when they come into the company to where they are a couple years later, we do professional development, article reviews. They get to participate in the conversation that we have around different cases, both clinically and just kind of the politics and the consulting that goes along with it. It's invaluable. It's an invaluable resource, and I know other companies do it, and I don't want to impart my particular feelings and model to everybody else, but it has been widely received as a good idea, at least until people get their feet under them a little bit. A lot of people, they start companies or they go into private practice. They don't have a network of people. They don't know how to get information. And those problems are exacerbated when you talk about, not having people physically present, or language barriers, or lack of translated resources, and all these other things. So it's interesting to be able to consider these new ways based on the complaints that people have, legitimate complaints that people have about the way the system has been in the past.
There's an incredible chat happening right now. I'm going to quickly highlight this before we go into the next question. So Valeria mentions how some folks were never given the opportunity, some never were given the opportunity to train staff or parents as a primary trainer or wrote a behavior plan from start to finish. I mentioned that this is, yeah, the system that we have in place right now is not systematic. Adair mentioned exactly. Luckily, I had some experience in the United States before I got here in Senegal, but my colleague didn't, and she had an extremely tough time due to the total lack of supports here. She had to drop out. Leah mentioned, I love that my company requires weekly supervision meetings with my supervisor, as I find the insight and guidance very useful as a new BCBA. So it's almost like mentorship or an apprentice relationship, which is kind of lovely. Agreed, I had to push for those opportunities when I was an intern because the BCBA didn't see it important at that time. I'm so sorry, Radhika, that was your experience. Valeria mentions, I think the board did a good job at developing the minimum requirements for the coursework, but the supervised experience portion is still loosey-goosey. That's a really interesting point, and personally, I can't help but agree. So now let's move on to our next question. So I'm going to be introducing a few different ASRs to the panel, but also our attendees. So per the board, 96% of participants live within the US and Canada, while 4% are spread out across 94 countries, quite a bit. So with that in mind, attendees, I would like to poll the audience and see how many of you are currently or previously provided services outside of the United States and Canada. You can just quickly maybe mention something locally again, or in the chat. It'd be really fun. You, Shane, where?
I am in the United States, in Florida.
Nice. Kayla mentions the United States, Colorado. Kansha, only outside. Valeria, I live in the US but work in Brazil and have provided supervision in Ireland and Spain. Interesting. I have provided services. The answers are coming in so quickly. Can you clarify the services you're speaking of? I have provided services in the States and now I'm in Spain, Brazil, here, Ghana currently, UAE, India, Nigeria, Qatar. Wow, Pennsylvania, Virginia, California, Senegal. We have folks from all over who have also provided services all over. This is nice. We do have a question that was sent in, and I do want to pose this before we go to our next ASR. So speaking of certification, moving ethically and doing things differently from the BACB's evolution, why is IBAB not waiting to have certification? Why are they moving so quickly is the question that was posed. This was posed in a private chat. So.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to be part of the solution. We could have waited and come out 6 months with something that was more polished. We could have we kind of done things a lot of different ways, and I think if people would have done this on their own, there was probably other ways to do it. We didn't have a model to follow. We definitely recognize the need, both from our own personal experiences and those of our colleagues that we have talked to that travel around. So we wanted to get it established and then form a board so that the board can form new requirements going forward. So our interest was to be part of the solution, form a team, and then teams under those that can inform this in all the different ways that we've just talked about with regional, ethical, national issues at mind that matter, so that the product is informed by those things from the very beginning.
Wonderful. So now we can move on to the next question. Again, this is ASR style. So how many of you are currently providing services to individuals who are either first generation American or Canadians or immigrants? I can quickly chime in. When I was a technician or behavior tech, I provided services to folks from Spain, Central America, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba. Oh, great. So we have Valeria, Kayla, Radhika. Nice. So there are some folks who have provided services to folks who are who have come from other countries and other contexts. Nice. Jennifer, Stephanie, Yodi, Gloria. Yes, definitely. Absolutely. Neat. Okay. This is just to get a general pulse of the folks who are in. And our final question for now, have any of the attendees taken the board exam in another language outside of English, just out of curiosity? Interesting. Okay.
You know,
rapid fire answers.
You know, some of the folks that we have on the board and some of the people that we've talked to, I think one of the reasons there's such a low percentage of people that are certified outside the US and Canada was how difficult it is in so many areas, both to meet the requirements, you know, the experience requirements, the supervision requirements, but then actually the exam requirements too. It's not easy for some people to get to the very few centers that have those tests. It's not translated in all the different languages. But there's some really cool things that are happening right now in those areas where you can do online testing that has all kinds of different options that you don't have to be in a physical space. You can have someone kind of monitoring your computer. You can see what's on the different pages, what tabs are open, whether you're at the computer. They have basically like facial recognition algorithms that can tell what normal test takers' faces do and where they look and those kind of things. And it can flag abnormalities. So you can get a report of these things afterwards, go in, and it's videoing you as you're taking the test. It has, you know, sensors for multiple people, whether you're in your seat, out of your seat, all these kind of things. So they're really, I mean, to have to drive hours to a test center to physically sit at one particular place is going to be a thing in the past, I would assume, for the BACB also, but it doesn't need to be part of anything going forward. There's just too many robust options that can break down some of those barriers for people.
Absolutely, and we have folks chiming in the chats. Sarah mentions that she has heard of folks having to personally need to drive, and Amelia mentioned she had to fly to London. Yeah, we do not have a testing center anywhere in West Africa. Folks who live in Jordan had to go to Greece to take it. So some folks had to travel quite a distance just to be able to sit in for an exam. That's incredible. Valeria mentions she was in a ballroom in a hotel in Orlando back in, Valeria earlier mentioned that she took her BACB exam using pen and paper. So this was a while back then. In Brazil, we only have one testing center. So most of us need to fly there. So it's quite the response. It's such a high response effort to go and sit in for your board exam. The BCBA exam was translated into 11 languages or 12, none of which were French, which is one of the primary languages here. Again, in Senegal, almost nobody speaks English. Wow, guys, I think this has been honestly the most incredible chat discussion I've ever been privy to. This is fantastic. All right, so for our next question, panel, what suggestions do you have in supporting our fellow analysts in other countries develop their own credentialing process? How would this look like? What sort of technique and tools and processes can we help and assist in the development of these sort of certification processes? What can we do on our end? If say we are not a part of, say, the IBAB, if say we're not a part of the BACB, what can the average Joe BCBA or BCABA do to help support folks creating these sort of certification processes?
It probably depends on, you know, going back to what was mentioned earlier, the infrastructure locally. Some places have that well developed, and if you want to be a part of anything moving forward, you probably have to jump into those activities. If that's a professional organization, then be part of it. If you're in an area where things aren't even organized to that part, then organize them to that, you know, to that first step. It seems like this was a long time ago, but before there was the Georgia Association of Behavior Analysis, I mean, the first couple meetings were literally like 4 or 5 people in someone's living room. right? Now they have a hotel space and 2 days of conference presentations and workshops and all that kind of stuff, but it didn't start that way. It really started with just a couple of people who were BCBAs at the time saying we should probably do this too. It was super informal, but it did get the wheel turning, so that when other people got in and they kind of took the reins and said, well, let's do it this way, and it just kind of progressed. It's those kind of things in areas that don't have them that are going to lead to the most change in those areas. Some of our goals are to link up with those kind of organizations and see if there are ways to collaborate, if there are ways to move the ball forward from where they're at. We suspect that we'll have some opportunities in some places and maybe not in others. But I think if people are trying to help and trying to get involved, if there's a movement already in place, get in with that. If there's not, then just kind of like what we saw, it's a good opportunity to have a voice in those changes if you want to.
I think we need to, sorry, Megan, did you want to?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So just discriminating between criticism and constructive feedback. I think we need to practice kindness in the current scenario, and also arrive at the understanding that every country or every region is going to have its own struggles with setting up their own processes. Also, processes take time to get established. The timeline that has been provided by the board requires an urgent call to action, and we've had to hit the ground running. So just all of these different processes. I'm on the IBAB Professional Advisory Board, so I can say that they're constantly being evaluated, and we would love the valuable contributions of everyone in the behavior analytic community. But it's very important for all of us to step outside of the perspective of the systems that we currently practice in and maybe used to, and think of potential solutions and then engage in dialogue with kindness. Yeah.
That's so funny. I was going to say something so similar to that. Like, be flexible and be open. Just because your history is what you've seen with the BACB does not mean that's what is the end all be all. And we've already talked about that didn't work. They said it doesn't work. So we need to be flexible and understanding that each area has different resources and look at what we can do. I love what Molly from the Global Autism Project talks about doing with, not for. So looking at what places already have in their infrastructure, what they're lacking, and ask what you can do to help. Don't come in with your ideas and your history and say, well, this is how I do it, and if you do it any other way, you're wrong or you're unethical. Constructive criticism and feedback is obviously helpful, and we want to be above board, but just because something's different doesn't mean it's wrong or bad. Then the last thing is recognizing that people throughout the world, I've been to many different countries, and I'm always surprised by everyone's sort of they really hold the BACB up to this really high standard and don't recognize their own strengths and what they understand about the science of behavior analysis. You can understand the science and know nothing about the board. And that's not to like denigrate the board or anything like that, but recognize that just because countries don't have BCBAs doesn't mean they don't know about behavior analysis. Some of the best and most knowledgeable behavior analysts I've met have never heard of the BCBA. Or wouldn't seek to become one because they've learned the science through the university program. So just recognizing that as well, that people know what they're talking about, and help support them in developing the resources they need in the area that they're living in.
And to kind of piggyback on everything everyone's been saying so far, it's don't come in and say, like tell people what to do. You have to really listen to what people in those countries want. Like Akanksha, and I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, just gave a wonderful presentation on avoiding a white savior complex and disseminating ABA globally. And that hits the nail on the head. For those of us who are not part of those countries, we really have to listen to the people who are there and make ourselves available, but we can't come in and start shoehorning ourselves into it saying, we know what's best for you. I'm here to be the be all end all to help you see the light of behavior analysis, you know, we can help, but we have to be wanted. Like, we should make sure our help is wanted, not force it upon people.
So we have a few questions that were sent to us anonymously. So I'm going to read those after I mention some of the cool things that are occurring in the chat. Shane wrote, "Good point, Megan. The entire EAB field does not subscribe to the BACB rules," which is always interesting. Stephanie mentions, "I think as a BCBA abroad, it is extremely important to reach out to colleagues for help. Participating in events like this is also incredibly helpful. Like Shane says, it allows us to create networks. Savior behavior is not a great thing. The presentation Amelia just mentioned will be available via a Comfortable X. So if folks want to review that presentation, you are able to do so. And now I'm going to quickly read the questions that were sent to us anonymously. And the first one is, and I'll read them one after the other, and you can decide who wants to respond. Is the IBAB collaborating with other behavior analysis organizations, such as ABAI or APBA, or other professionals such as counselors, therapists, and looking at their licensure, ethical codes, etc.? IBAB currently does not have any ethical codes, but is currently certifying individuals." And then also from the same individual, "How do we apply to join the advisory board of IBAB or of the committees that are looking at cultural and supervision differences that Malcolm Mueller spoke on earlier?"
I'll try to answer those if I can remember all of them.
Sorry, so many.
No problem. Yeah, how to get to the professional advisory board, that would be emailing me. I have a letter and a form to fill out. We have, we were discussing this, right? So how do you know what's the right number of people to have on an advisory board? We have a bunch on there now. It's been organized in a way that things are moving along. It could probably be too small and not representative enough, but it could also be maybe too big. So you would send your information to me. I would, basically see where you're from, and hopefully we need additional voices in that area. We have essentially a preference survey that we're looking at the different requirements that we're trying to develop, so people on the board can kind of focus on the things that are more interesting to them, whether that's supervision or exam details or exam questions or CEs, those types of things, so that everybody's not doing everything. There will be a collaborative process at some point, but in order to get things done moving forward, smaller work groups were chosen. So that's how you would do that. What was the very first one? I'm sorry, what was the very first question?
Okay. The first one was,
are we working with others? So we're not.
Are you working with other organizations?
We are not. We're not working with anybody else right now for a couple different reasons. One, we want the process to be totally organic from the people that are on the advisory board, right? I think if we start collaborating with any group that does similar things, then we're going to be pulled for different reasons into those directions. And I don't think we need that kind of gravity in the process. We want this to be totally unique and different from those. If there are ways to collaborate with existing organizations, large organizations down the road, that would be great, but we want to establish what we set out there to do first before we do that. Now, with that being said, the different people that are on the board are part of organizations, and they're part of different both practice organizations, universities abroad, and locally, so that people are bringing influence into that, but we're not going out right now and trying to establish relationships with ABAI or the BACB. After we have our requirements out there, we will want to go to probably local universities, current BCS providers, because if you're providing one set of content, if there's overlap, and there probably necessarily will have to be, since we're talking about behavior analysis, with what we come up with, it might be very easy for current providers to also be providers for us. So our goal is to try to increase accessibility in every way that we can. So the more people that will have whatever the content is, the better. But that's about 2 steps ahead of where we're at right now. In terms of the ethics code, we don't have our own specific ethics code, but we're relying on people following generally accepted practices, both the BACBs, the ones that have been established by the QABA, ones that are following the general principles of psychology, ethics, and the APA guidelines. We have a panel, a committee right now that is actively addressing some of those questions and putting together what will be guidelines. I say guidelines relative to a code for the same reasons that it's probably that, similarly to the way that the BACB decided that they probably couldn't enforce things all over the place. I don't know that it's a reasonable expectation for us to do that. We'll definitely need a system to handle complaints. We need some kind of review process, but I don't know that it's going to be, well, I do know it won't immediately be a replacement in, like a letter-to-letter replacement for what the BACB had. It's also important to remember too that in the history of the BACB, that's a fairly recent process, right? It switched from guidelines to this enforceable code just a few years ago. So even though it's looked at and people have the mindset that you can't do it any other way, they didn't even do it this way 6 years ago. So from 1998 to whatever it was, 2016, it wasn't the same kind of process. And they have their reasons for doing that, and we're going to have reasons for doing things a little bit differently. So as a starting point, it'll whatever the advisory board comes up with will probably look different 5 years after that or whatever else. But the other cool thing about the way that we're going about this is, like I said, there's different ethical considerations in different countries. And so I think the theme right now is probably to have some kind of generally accepted strategies, ones that apply to different places when you're in and practicing in those areas. So it will have to be different to meet the goals of the board necessarily right from the start. And what was the very last question, or was that the last question?
I believe that was the last question. That was sent in anonymously. All right, I think we are out of time, and I do want to be cognizant of everyone's time since this is a panel that's occurring on Saturday. I did have this one last question for the attendees, but we can probably skip it because we kind of did touch upon this earlier on with the chat discussion. But I do want to say thank you to everyone for attending. There are still so many bits of discussion that we should probably embark on, maybe via email. I do want to see if everyone can, for those who are interested, if you want to continue having this sort of discussion, please reach out to the Dissemination of Behavior Analysis. We would love to hear it at disseminateaba@gmail.com. I would love to hear what your thoughts are on creating that first initial tangible low response effort step in the right direction when it comes to assisting those who are working outside of the United States and Canada. How can we help support folks who are working within a global capacity? I would love to hear your thoughts, your ideas, and your own action plans when it comes to that sort of thing. And let's keep the conversation going. If you want to continue talking about this, again, our email is available to everyone. We can also maybe have another discussion about this very topic sometime in the future, just to see how things are coming along as well. I would love to hear your updates on those action plans that we're going to hopefully have set in stone. But yes, and quickly, yes, I will be sending out an email after this talk, probably tomorrow, because technically, I don't know if you see the setting, I'm actually at a conference. So I stepped out so I can have this conversation with all of you, but I will send everyone an email tomorrow with panelist emails if you want to continue discussion, our emails as well. And I will also send out the recording link if you want to review this chat. Again, you're more than welcome to do so. And if any of you have any other questions, comments, concerns, please reach out to us at our email. All right, well, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your Saturday. Take care, and I'm excited to hear what your dissemination, global dissemination projects and ideas are in the future.
Bye,
Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Thank you for being here. Annie, I'm dying.